One of the things I like to do most on this channel is to do video responses. And lately I've just been too busy. I haven't been producing much in the way of content related to the stuff I'm reading and discovering and playing, and I haven't been doing anything in terms of the video response. So I've got a few moments now, and I'd like to use them to do a video response to Sameoldji, who, I always do video responses to Sameoldji because this content is so great. And recently he put out 2 videos on the new edition of 7th Sea and how he finds it to be a great example of the growing divide within the hobby.
Like 30-some years, people have been playing a certain way. They play a task-based resolution, pass or fail, mostly. Maybe yet a little bit of variation, but it's basically that. Like pass or fail, task-based resolution with a GM that tells what's going on.
Now he defines it as a cultural clash, and he ties it to some terms that I'm not very fond of. I find that those terms themselves create confusion and obscure things, and they don't by themselves have a whole lot of relevant meaning. They're just terms that people like to use. But in this clip, I'll have to use them to make any sense in comparison to his video, in relation to his video. So the terms I'm talking about are things like GM Fiat, traditional game, and indie game. I find the term indie game to be so useless as to be almost ridiculous, and traditional game is not much better, and GM Fiat is a loaded term. So what would I prefer to use? GM Fiat refers to actions taken by the game master in the mode that the game allows them to play. What do I mean by that confusing statement? If you've got a system that does resolution of whatever with some version of pass or fail, either straight pass or fail, or pass with degrees of success and fail with degrees of failure, the play part of it provided for the GM player, and all the people at the table are players, and this shouldn't be forgotten. What they have given to them as their mode of play is determining the outcome of the die roll. Their responsibility is to make that collaborative, but they're the one who speaks last, because if they don't, they have nothing else to do. Calling it GM Fiat casts them in the role of dictator, and a lot of games have been written from the point of view that that's what the GM is. The adversarial GM has become the stereotype. I'm sure we've all met one. I'm also pretty sure that they're in the minority. I'm also pretty sure that this is something that people can grow into if the players in the group aren't pulling their weight. This is something that can be allowed to happen, and this is something that can't be squelched simply by saying don't do it, and it can't be squelched simply by making mechanics. It's going to happen anyway. If you have a mechanic which brings out shades of narration, like we see in Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars, for example, where not only is it pass or success, but how, and introducing ways to tie that into relevant parts of character and scene. Your domineering person who will take control of narration of the dice, even though the game has got this print in it clearly explaining that that's not the function of the game master in this game. What are you going to do about that? So GM Fiat is related more to the person than to the game. It's related more to the person than the style of game. So let's call it what it is. Let's call it resolution. There are games where the fun, the role of the game master is to determine the outcome of rolls. And then there are games where it isn't. Okay. Now some people do have habits where they are responsible for task resolution, and that's what they see as normal, and they're either not interested or don't have time for, or lack the enjoyment of a different way to play. As Sameoldji states quite accurately, there are some who don't even know what they're missing out on. They might enjoy it, or there's some who've just experimented shallowly and were turned off or intimidated. They didn't like feeling like beginners again, perhaps, or they felt unsure. How can I create my story if I don't have this responsibility of resolving what's happening after a die roll? And that, to me, is the culture clash. It's not about who gets to decide what happens. It's not about when I think about important things to my character. It's never been about that. As far back as I can think of, even playing First Ed Dungeons and Dragons, the game that I started with, my characters have had goals. And that's what I've been striving toward, regardless of what module someone was running us through, or what homemade dungeon we were crawling through. My character had goals, and the game was about that. This is not new. Mechanizing it is a way to provide a different way to play, to get the game master involved in different ways, or remove the game master altogether so that everyone is interacting with the game system in the same way rather than in different ways. I don't want to use the term equally and unequally, because to me, equally, they're all players. Someone has taken on a different role when there's a game with a GM. But in Sameoldji's video, the point that I see as the culture clash is story. And the complaints from the people called traditional gamers and the reaction by the people labeled as indie gamers, it's about the story. The so-called, the words put in the mouth of the traditional gamer is, there's no surprise. If you write the story out in advance, or if you get to determine what the story is, blah, blah, blah. This is tied to story, not choice. Because as you describe in the video, the mechanics are determining whether or not something is successful. Something outside of the player is determining whether or not you're successful, be that a game master, be that a card draw, a die roll, or whatever. There can still be surprise and modulation, and yes, the goals have relevance. The goals have maybe more focus in every moment of play than they might be if we were running through a series of purchase modules from the 80s. Might. It's not a requirement. It's related to what happens at each table. So it's not something we can really talk about. But the one aspect that remains true is the existence of story arc versus its absence. And that's the core, recognized or unrecognized, of the culture clash. Prior to 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons, I believe, the language was beginning to shift. So by the time we receive 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons, the Game Master's Guide is describing things like campaign as story arcs. Whereas before, this was not the conception of campaign at all. But it evolved. How did this evolve? Maybe it was the availability of purchase stories. Maybe it was, things like Dragonlance. Who knows? But I'm sure somebody knows. I don't personally know right now. The idea is that somewhere we went from entering a world and acting upon it and within it as being role-playing games, to being stars of stories. This is a huge, huge shift of what it is to play the game. This divide is so big between players of games, even when the people involved are cognizant enough to recognize that they need some sort of different label or name for the way that they play, such as what was suggested before with role-playing game versus story game. So big is this divide that you can have a conversation face to face and not only not recognize that they have no idea what you're talking about, neither one of you is participating in the same conversation. And you may not even realize that until much later. And YouTube makes this a little bit easier because you have a record of what people are saying back and forth to each other, either in a Hangout or in a video response, where they're talking about the exact same situation using very similar terms, and yet one person is totally conceptualizing the activity as being related to a story arc. This is something that starts somewhere and goes somewhere, versus someone who's thinking of it from, to use another popular phrase, playing to find out. But even playing to find out doesn't always mean what you think it might mean. We have a planned story, and let's play it to find out how that plan happens, versus let's not have any story at all whatsoever. Let's have story elements like characters and trees and drought, and play to find out what happens. And what happens doesn't have to be tied to traditional story structures. It may reveal tropes, but it doesn't have to be crafted from them. It may have beats, but doesn't have to have beats forced upon them, and so on and so forth. This, as I see it, is the heart of the culture clash. Everything else described about who gets to have authority over the role and who gets to decide what the story is about, these are symptoms. Because in a game with no story, the only person who can decide what it's about are the people in the roles of characters. That's the game master through the vehicle of the NPCs advancing the agendas in the nothingness of story, and the players acting in character in that environment, pursuing their own goals. The interaction, the cross-section of those competing agendas, which are not tied to a story arc, they're not tied to a trope, they're not tied to, well, last week was very action heavy, so we should have some kind of emotive scene here, so let's put in this kind of low beat. None of this is involved at all. So when these two people sit down to have a conversation, both thinking that's what play is, both thinking that story means the same thing, and the conversation occurs at the same time but doesn't actually meet. It's fascinating and disheartening at the same time. I worked pretty hard to get good at telling stories, and I did that mostly in Storyteller. I guess like a lot of people my age, perhaps. I thought that this was the next evolution of skill, and then for a long time afterward I thought it was the worst possible thing I could have done. I'm through the other side of it now, and looking back on it, I just see it as another skill set, another way to do something. I found the skills that I developed then to be really useful in very specific situations. But my preferences lie in discovery, and we want to use words like emergent, but even that can't be used safely anymore because it can still apply to the other interpretation. See, for me, story is something that you recognize looking backward. And I see what story took shape from what we decided to do and how people interacted. But if you plan out a story, like the characters will go here and the characters will go there and the characters are struggling to achieve these goals, and we want to wrap this up in around 20 sessions, it'll take more or less that number of sessions, so it should build in this way, and we'll see if they're successful. There's still an emergent story there. It's built from different story elements. It's built from elements that involve planning arcs of story versus planning actors, people who take actions in places. It's difficult even to describe to my reflection in the computer screen. So this is my video response to Sameoldji, that I think there is a culture clash. I totally agree. I think that traditional gamers have a different outlook on some modern games, and I think people who grew up with some modern games, when they look at traditional games, they don't know how to see them. And I think people in the middle are rightly confused about what people mean when they talk about things. I think the people on the outer edges, going backward and going forward, think they have much less confusion. They have a lot of certainty about what they're talking about, and that certainty gets in the way of understanding the other person's perspective. And if we are to be a community, if we are to deal with this culture clash in one way or another, either by saying these things are different and let's stop pretending that they're not, or if we want to enable people to cross over, if we want to build bridges, then we better learn what the other people actually mean. And the only way we're going to do that is to pinpoint what the real problem is. I don't think it comes down to control. I do not believe it comes down to choice. I think that is related to the personality of the people who play. Instead, I would say it's the existence versus non-existence of story and the level of awareness about this concept at all. What do you think?